have captured the imagination, made a lot of people feel proud, and just confirmed some things that some people felt all along. I'm talking about Martin Bernal, who's written a very interesting book, very instructive, very educational book entitled Black Athena. Oh, by the way, my name is Bernard White, and I'm affiliated with WBAI Radio. This program is, part of it is you will probably hear at some future date on WBAI. You're getting it now for free. So, don't forget that. Well, free, so to speak, anyway. We expect Dr. John Henrik Clarke to be here in a little while. He's been caught up in traffic. Someone went to pick him up a little earlier, and they haven't gotten there yet. But Martin Bernal is here. In order to try and set the stage a little bit for some of what we're going to be talking about this evening, well, what they're going to talk about this evening, is I'd like to bring to you something that was written in the Wall Street Journal of February the 14th. And it's entitled, Greece for the Greeks, History is Not Bunk. And it's written by Roger Kimball. And he says, anyone interested in learning about how extreme the falsification of history for politically correct motives has become will savor Not Out of Africa. Now, I know how many of you have seen this book, Not Out of Africa, written by Mary Lefkowitz. Yeah. It says how Afrocentrism became an excuse to teach myth as history. And it is an attempt by the Heritage Foundation, part of a continuing attempt by the Heritage Foundation and one other foundation, I can't remember the name of it now, that has taken it upon themselves to spend a lot of money and a lot of energy in trying to reverse some of this history that's coming out, some of these attempts to try and explode the myth of classical Greek origins of history. And he goes on to say in this article that anyone interested in learning about how extreme the falsification of history for politically correct motives has become will savor Not Out of Africa. Mary Lefkowitz's definitive dissection of Afrocentrism. In its simplest terms, the doctrine of Afrocentrism claims that many of the great achievements of classical civilization were stolen from Black Africa. It is the belief of Afrocentrists that Greek philosophy and science were largely pilfered from African sources. A subsidiary claim is that many famous historical figures, Socrates and Cleopatra, for example, were black, or at least partly black. How could the world have labored for centuries in ignorance of such monumental cultural pillage? I kind of like that. According to the Afrocentrists, it was no accident. They claim that the black African contribution to world history has been systematically covered up by a white conspiracy to deny the black race the proper recognition of its intellectual and cultural legacy. I kind of believe that. Some of the wildly unhistorical claims of Afrocentrism, one of my favorites, touts the existence of ancient Egyptians to bear on its claims. In Not Out of Africa, Ms. Lefkowitz, a distinguished classicist who teaches at Wesley College, has exploded by one by one the central tenets of Afrocentrism with an unprecedented thoroughness and authority. I don't know if you've seen the book, but that did not happen in that book. For example, one of the keynotes of Afrocentric theory is the contention that Greek philosophy was plagiarized from an ancient Egyptian mystery system. But Ms. Lefkowitz shows in meticulous detail that the whole idea of Egyptian mystery system was of Greco-Roman origins, and that its modern interpretation is based largely on the myths and rituals of Freemasonry, which in turn derived partly from various occult sources, and partly from an 18th century novel about ancient Egypt. Ms. Lefkowitz works through this tangible tangle of esoterica with remarkable patience and clarity. Both are needed since the very extravagance of the claims made by Afrocentrists make them difficult to take seriously or indeed refute. What counts as evidence when the most basic and well-established facts of world history are suddenly subject to mystification. Unfortunately, many of Afrocentrism's central claims have found their way into common currency. In 1994, in a lecture at New Jersey's King College, and this is a tactic that a lot of the folks use, they will take a statement that's made that's bizarre and forget about all of the substance that was being made and just focus on that one item that's bizarre. But it goes on to say that at King College, the Reverend Al Sharpton explained that white folks was in the caves while we was building empires. We taught philosophy and astrology and mathematics before Socrates and gave them Greek homos, and them Greek homos ever got around to it. Oh, before them Greek homos ever got around to it. Now, you pick the part that just doesn't make, it's unnecessary. Even more extraordinary is the degree to which claptrap has gained academic legitimacy. Many elements of Afrocentrism are now standard ingredients in high school and college curricula. Unsuspecting students eager to discover a glorious past for Black Africa are required to study not the historical record, but the congeries of outright fabrications. Early on in her book, Ms. Lefkowitz recounts the occasion in 1993 when one Dr. Yosef A. Ben-Jochannan, a committed Afrocentrist, delivered Wesley's Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Lecture, among many others. Mr. Ben-Jochannan told his audience that Aristotle had gone to Egypt and robbed his philosophy from African writers in the library at Alexandria. During the question period, Ms. Lefkowitz asked how Aristotle could have stolen his philosophy from the library at Alexandria when Aristotle had died before the library was even built. But Mr. Ben-Jochannan replied that he resented the tone of her question. Her colleagues, meanwhile, maintained an embarrassed silence after the lecture. Several students came up to Ms. Lefkowitz to accuse her of racism. Okay, I'll stop there because I'm beginning to feel I'm reading too much. However, what we're going to do this evening is we have two individuals that, at least so far two individuals, who are going to begin to give a basis to some of this new information that's coming out. As you know, at WBAI over the last couple of months, we've been playing a piece by Molefi Asante, where he begins to talk about the roots of Afrocentricity. He's one of the proponents of Afrocentricity. He's written a book on Afrocentricity, and he's been pushing the whole idea that this basis on which we all learn history may not be so secure. That it's not necessarily the way we've been taught. Most of us here are from the generation where a lot of what we learned about history took place after we got out of school, because the information just wasn't available, and it was available, but it wasn't accessible. We have two individuals here on the podium today that have spent their lives in making this information accessible and available and putting it in a way that we can digest it. Martin Bernal, in his book, Black Athena, begins to address the question of what is classical about classical civilization. In one of the most audacious works of scholarship ever written, Martin Bernal challenges the whole basis of our thinking about this question. Classical civilization, he argues, has deep roots in Afro-Asiatic cultures, but these Afro-Asiatic influences have been systematically ignored, denied, or suppressed since the 18th century, chiefly for racist reasons. In Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic roots of classical civilization, Martin Bernal exposes the myths on which Western education is based. So without further ado, I want to bring to you Martin Bernal. And if you can get an opportunity to pick up these two books, Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, Volume 1 and 2, I suggest that you do that. There's a lot of information in there that we all need. Because I know that probably, as you began to find out what you were taught was untrue, that you probably got as angry as I did, that we were forced to sit in a classroom for hours and learn a bunch of things that were untrue. So Mark Bernal.
Thank you very much indeed. With apologies to Mr. Kimball, Mary Lefkowitz's book is extremely superficial and very silly. There's no question about it. On the other hand, its promotion by extreme right-wing financing is a significant political phenomenon. And therefore, I think we need to look at her book in some detail. Now, at one level, you could say that it is sad that the right always sets the agenda to which the liberals and left have to respond. On the other hand, you could see that it is a triumph of Afrocentrism that it is requiring an attack. Because I think that a fundamental challenge to a discipline usually goes through 3 or 4 stages. It is, first of all, ignored, then dismissed, then attacked, and then sometimes absorbed, or part of it absorbed. But we have now definitely reached the attack phase, which goes after many years of ignoring and dismissal. Now, I think it's difficult for me to describe Afrocentrism because as someone whose ancestors were slavers rather than slaves, it's difficult for me to do that. Intellectually, I can try and get into a position of looking at the world from Africa, but I can't feel it in the way that most of you can. And I think the label Afrocentrist has been attached to a wide range of intellectual positions, which go from all good things come from Africa, or as Professor Jeffries says, Africa creates, Europe imitates, to those among whom I see myself, who merely maintain that Africans or people of African descent have made many significant contributions to world progress, and that for the past 2 centuries these have been systematically played down by European and North American historians. Mary Lefkowitz portrays Afrocentrists as living in a sealed-off intellectual ghetto, impervious to outside information, where they pay no attention to the truth of their propositions, but are purely concerned with the feel-good factor, boosting the low self-esteem of African Americans. She denies that such a project should have any place in the teaching of history, and thus she feels obliged to stand up and be counted against what she sees as the Afrocentrist assault on the basic principles of education, respect for facts, logical argument, and open debate. And for this reason, she wrote a series of overlapping articles on these myths. And the book, which has just come out, is a compilation or a cobbling together of these articles. And its purpose is to expose Afrocentric absurdities once and for all, but its length is required because their demolition has turned out to be rather more complicated than she first supposed. Now, Mary Lefkowitz dislikes not merely the people who are known today as Afrocentrists, but anybody, any African American or African, who claims an affinity with Egypt. And these include Frederick Douglass, Edward Blyden, and W.E.B. Du Bois, for claiming a common African heritage. However, her rogues gallery consists of Dr. Clarke, Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Ben, and me, but above all, George G.M. James. We are the rogues, although I play a very minor part in the gallery at this stage. Now, there's no doubt that various Afrocentrist writers have made mistakes. And I think that this is true of Dr. James in particular. And I think that they have done this for a number of reasons. One is being embattled in a hostile academic and social world. The other is the possession of an absolute and general truth, which makes one have less concern about details. But far more important than either of these factors have been the extraordinary material difficulties that the scholars have faced in acquiring training in the requisite languages, in finding time and space to carry on research, money to buy books or even gain access to libraries, let alone finding publishers who could provide academic checks and competent proofreaders. None of these difficulties apply to Mary Lefkowitz, who has been thoroughly educated in Latin and Greek, though not in ancient Egyptian, and has for many years been tenured at a rich college and has received financial grants from massive foundations in order to write her attacks on Afrocentrism. That Mary Lefkowitz should make so many factual errors is much more intriguing. I won't give you all the examples. If you want to get more of them, my review of her book is coming out in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education in the April issue. But I will give you a couple. She states that hieroglyphics were deciphered in 1836. In fact, Champollion, the man who deciphered them, died in 1831. She says that the theory that the Nile flood is the result of snow melted by south winds was not far from the truth. In fact, of course, it's false, and as the great Greek scientist Eudoxus, who was trained in Egypt, realized that it was a result of rains in Ethiopia, by which he obviously included the rest of the Lacustrian region of East Africa. No, we're all capable of this kind of sloppiness, and such errors are relatively trivial and harmless. Other mistakes are less innocent. For instance, she says that Eudoxus was supposed to have gone to Egypt when it was under Persian domination. Mary Lefkowitz is virtually alone in doubting that he did go, and it's also generally agreed that he went in the 380s or 370s BC when Egypt was independent. This error, too, might seem to be simply the result of a slapdash approach. However, the mistake helps her general case that the ancient Greeks knew very little about Egypt by suggesting that Eudoxus did not visit Egypt, and if he did, she wants it both ways, the knowledge of it was somehow obscured by Persian rule. A more substantial error is her statement that since the founding of this country, the USA, ancient Greece has been intimately connected with the ideals of democracy. In fact, the very source she cites states precisely the opposite, and I'll quote from the source. In 1787 and 1788, the anti-federalists did not have a classical leg to stand on. There was no tradition of representative democracy to which they could appeal. The direct democracies like Athens bore the stigma of instability, violence, corruption, and injustice that even many friends of democracy in America avoided using the word. Like the advocates of mixed government, they used the word republic. Mary Lefkowitz's sloppiness here might seem inconsequential, but in fact it serves two very important purposes in her general argument. The first is that one cannot have freedom or democracy without a respectful awareness of ancient Greece. The second is that there's been a continuous flame of such reverence that can only be doused at our peril. Therefore, she implies, Afrocentrists are the enemies of freedom. Now, the first suggestion that you can't have freedom without ancient Greece is untenable even in the Western tradition. Something's happening to the mics here, I don't know what. Yeah. The English Revolution, well, I won't go into, but all the major revolutions were carried out before 1820 did not use Greece as a model. And images of Greece since 1820 have on the whole been in a progressive direction, but not always. In antebellum southern writers used ancient Greece and Athens in particular to demonstrate the political and cultural benefits of slavery. And today, extreme conservatives, including Mary Lefkowitz, are using images of ancient Greece for their own political agendas. Another type of error that she makes is discovering what she wants and failing to check further. For instance, she insists that Diodorus of Sicily, who emphasizes Egyptian connections and who priests talk to him, And she wants to say he didn't know anything about ancient Egypt, and he was always very vague. So she says, these included many Egyptian customs in the Greek laws. He, Diodorus, does not say what exactly these laws might have been. Presumably, no one really knew. The idea that early Greek law was inspired by Egyptian law is a historical fiction. However, if she'd read elsewhere, just a few sections earlier, she would have seen that Diodorus cites particular laws applied in Athens by Solon and Pisistratus, which were derived from Egypt. But it's clear that in her eagerness to discredit Diodorus as vague and unspecific, she failed to see, or at least to note, references that would weaken her case. There's another one which she uses, she attacks me by saying that I've been sloppy when I referred to Eusebius, the church father, having claimed that the legendary figure Inachos had settled in the Argolid from Egypt, and that I'd failed to document the reference. And then I gave, in fact, my reference to this in another place, which was cross-referenced in my book. I say, Castor, cited in Eusebius 1866 Chronicorum, translated from the Armenian by H. Peterman and edited A. Schöner Berlin Wiedmann, page 177. For the complications of Eusebius' text, see A. A. Mossheimer, The Chronicle of Eusebius, and the Greek chronographic tradition, Louisburg, Bucknell University Press, pp. 229-112. See also Ferré, Observations générales sur l'origine et sur l'ancienne histoire des premiers habitants de la Grèce, Académie des Inscriptions, 1784-1793. I did give quite specific references. She would seem to be the sloppy one here. Then there are various cases where she accuses me of saying things which I didn't say. Why should Mary Lefkowitz make so many slips and use so many slippery arguments when she doesn't have the excuse of many Afrocentrists in lacking training and resources? One reason is that although more than 4 years have passed since 1991, when she first encountered Afrocentrism, her book was obviously written in a hurry. It still shows signs of its origins and the cobbling together of articles written with passionate urgency for the popular and semi-popular press, with a few academic excursions. Nevertheless, I'm convinced that this is less significant than the impact of two other features. The first of these is her conviction that she possesses an absolute general truth that allows her to be cavalier with specifics. The second is that she and her allies feel besieged, and therefore they are sometimes obliged to abandon the niceties of open academic debate. Her general truth is that Greece did not derive any significant part of its civilization from Egypt. In this, she not only flies in the face of Greek and Roman tradition, but even goes further than most of her classicist colleagues. Then I give some examples of this, which are quite technical. And when she tries to say that it wasn't, Heracles wasn't descended, ancestors did not come from Egypt, but they came from a man called Aegyptus. And she says it's a different word from. Well, in fact, the two words apo and ek can be used interchangeably in this sense. And secondly, Aegyptos in Greek tradition came directly from Egypt himself, so it doesn't matter. But yet she uses this to intimidate with linguistic knowledge, and it's completely phony. Her far-fetched claim here can easily be explained in terms of her passion to separate Greece from Egypt, and a desire to use her language to intimidate Afrocentrists. It doesn't cast doubt on Mary Lefkowitz's knowledge of Greek and Latin. On the other hand, while she knows these languages, she doesn't know much about linguistics and has virtually no understanding of language contact, which is a relevant field when looking at the relations between Egypt and Greece. For instance, she writes, once they were able to read real Egyptian, it became clear to them that the relation of Egyptian to Greek culture was less close than they'd imagined. Egyptian belonged to the Afro-Asiatic family, while Greek was an Indo-European language akin to Sanskrit and European languages like Latin. Now, the family relationships are undoubtedly correct, but to my knowledge, no Afrocentrist has ever argued that there was a genetic relationship between the Egyptian and Greek languages. What they and I maintain is that ancient Egyptian culture had a massive impact on that of Greece, and that this is reflected in a substantial number of Egyptian loanwords from Greek. I estimate that 25% of the basic Greek vocabulary is Egyptian, and a further 15 to 20% is Semitic. Mary Lefkowitz does not seem to realize that lexical loans primarily reflect contemporary contacts, not past genetic relationships. She goes on to say, linguists have long since noted relatively few words of Egyptian origin that have made their way into Greek. She doesn't mention that over half of the Greek vocabulary cannot be explained in terms of Indo-European, that is in the European language family, or consider the arguments that I made at length in Black Athena, A, that the lexicographers, the dictionary writers of Greek, have not known ancient Egyptian, and B, that since the 1820s, when hieroglyphics were first deciphered, there should have been ideological reasons why they should not have wanted to find Egyptian etymologies for significant or fundamental Greek words. It should be pointed out that it's precisely this historiographical or ideological aspect of my work that has been most widely accepted. I've had much more trouble with the archaeology and with the language. Nevertheless, Mary Lefkowitz is certain that there was no significant contact between Egypt and Greece before the former's conquest by Alexander the Great, and her faith in that general truth sustains her in all the twists and turns of her argument. She has a sense of belonging to a small band of defenders of reason against the forces of unreason, or the demon political correctness. This actually antedates her encounter with Afrocentrism. Before 1991, she was the scourge of what she saw as feminist nonsense in the classics. In both struggles, she has found powerful helpers on the far right. In the preface to Not Out of Africa, she thanks Wellesley College and the Bradley and John M. Olin Foundations for their grants. The latter two are among the most generous contributors to many right-wing organizations, including the National Review, the Heritage Foundation, the National Association of Scholars, NAS, and Mary Lefkowitz, along with Jean Kirkpatrick, Peter Diamandopoulos, and 3 dozen others, sits on the advisory board of the National Association of Scholars, and she plays an active role in its journal, Academic Questions. The main concern of all these organizations and journals is turning back what their members and contributors view as the tides of liberalism and multiculturalism that have engulfed not only society, but also education and the highbrow media. This explains why they see themselves as besieged or potential or actual victims of their enemies. In some ways, this imagery resembles the sense of isolation and persecution experienced by many black Afrocentrists, which may explain the reaction of Dr. Ben and the students to her interference. However, there's a fundamental difference between her and the Afrocentrists she wanted to criticize, in that the Afrocentrists really are in a difficult situation, while she and her allies are in one that is largely imaginary. Unlike the black scholars, or even white liberals, they are amply funded and have access to many prestigious journals. The articles that make up Not Out of Africa have appeared in the New Republic, the Wall Street Journal, Partisan Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Academic Questions. Thus, she and her conservative comrades have every opportunity to carry out research, publish their results, and participate freely in academic debates. Despite all this, she is extremely intolerant herself. Let me give a personal example. She, with a colleague, has organized the publication of a book entitled Black Athena Revisited. This massive work of 540 pages is largely made up of reviews of Black Athena, selected for their hostility to it. I was not informed of this project, but I was told of it later by an uncomfortable contributor. I immediately emailed Mary Lefkowitz saying that I looked forward to seeing the pieces so that I could prepare my response. She answered that they had decided not to have a response from me. I wrote back saying that this was very unusual not to include responses from a living subject of a book when he or she wanted to respond. She said that most of the pieces had appeared already and I'd published responses to them. Were these going to be included? No, it had been decided not to include them. So much for the free market of ideas. Actually, I then leaked it to the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I had 2 reactions to her behavior. One was outrage at her violation of academic norms. The second was that I felt extremely flattered. A, that they should devote a major work to attacking me, and B, that they should be so frightened of my responses that they couldn't include them. Now, before turning to her major attacks on Afrocentrist claims, it's necessary to consider two important issues of approach and method. The first of these is raised by Mary Lefkowitz when she admits that she may have biases, but says that this is very different from consciously setting out to achieve a particular political goal. She doesn't say what her biases are, but two of the most important come out loud and clear. They are that Europe owes nothing to Africa, or Greece to Egypt, and the second is that untrained outsiders should not question the conclusions of trained and competent professionals. She is able to avoid the charge of consciously setting out to achieve a political goal because she and those who think like her have until very recently held academic power. This was achieved during the 19th century by Northern European scholars who did have explicit ideological and political aims in denying European or Aryan indebtedness to Africans and Semites. The second issue of method is her insistence on a sharp distinction being made between what she calls warranted facts and acceptable claims. This, in fact, are rather similar to what I've called proof and competitive plausibility. I have never disputed that there are certainties. I accept, for instance, that there was a Holocaust in which over 6 million Jews and many others were murdered by Nazis. However, for Mary Lefkowitz to put this massively documented event, which took place in her and my lifetime, on the same plane as the reconstruction of the murky origins of Greek civilization some 2,500 years ago, is absurd. We're not dealing with proof or warranted facts, but with competitive plausibility when looking at these. Furthermore, she appeals to plausibility and acceptability from her generally conservative, generally white audience as often, if not more often, than Afrocentrists do from their constituency. As she follows the modern classical establishment in its denial of the many Greek and Roman writers who believed in massive Greek cultural debt to Egypt, she is forced to overcome this ancient testimony by frequently using such words and phrases as apparently, evidently, do not seem, what if, why not? An extreme example is her treatment of an ancient tradition that Plato had based his Republic on an idealized image of Egypt. She writes, Bernal would take the story at face value, but the true origin was probably a joke in some comedy which was later taken seriously. Is this a warranted fact or an acceptable claim? We're both operating on the same plane of competitive plausibility. Then I won't deal with the individuals, the Socrates thing, although I do in the article. And we now come to the nub of Mary Lefkowitz's attack and rage. The charge that Greeks stole Egyptian religion, philosophy, and science. The first issue to be confronted here is that of the Hermetic corpus. These mystical and philosophical dialogues, many of them concerned with spiritual initiation, have centered on the mysterious figure of the sage or divine Hermes Trismegistos, and they were circulating in Egypt at least from the 1st century BC. Though written in Greek and containing many features and ideas that resemble those in Platonic and Neoplatonic writings, the characters described are Egyptian. On this issue, Mary Lefkowitz follows the standard interpretation of the early 20th century, and which is that in the early 17th century, these texts had been exposed as forgeries, and that they were essentially Greek writings in which the authors, for their own reasons, had portrayed themselves as Egyptians to enhance their reputations or as a literary conceit. She pays no attention to the reversal of scholarly opinion since the publication in the 1970s of the Library of Coptic Gnostic Texts at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. The result of the evident parallels between these and the Hermetic corpus has been, as the modern scholar Garth Howden has put it, quote, the intellectual context and origins of Hermeticism viewed in ever closer relationship to traditional Egyptian thought and to Gnosticism are the subject of a fast increasing number of scholarly studies. So in that area, she's really out of touch. Hermes' Egyptian equivalent was the Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth, and the name Hermes Trismegistos has a good Egyptian prototype in Thoth, thrice great. Nevertheless, Mary Lefkowitz is adamant that, quote, there is no record of any Egyptian language original from which they were derived. Apart from the close parallels in the Coptic text, there are in fact a number of demotic, that is late Egyptian, papyri containing substantial sections of a dialogue of completely hermetic type between Thoth and a disciple. Furthermore, Mary Lefkowitz does not engage the argument put forward by the great Egyptologist Sir William Flinders Petrie that some of the texts in the Hermetic corpus date back to the Persian period in the 6th and 5th century, before Plato arrived or when had contact with Greek culture. Thus, there's a real possibility that at least some of the similarities between the Hermetic text and the Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy could be the result of Plato and his followers having drawn on Egyptian sources. This brings us to the central issue of stolen legacy. Mary Lefkowitz lays great stress on George James and the other Afrocentrist writers having taken their ideas from the Masonic tradition, which in turn was based on 18th century novels, notably Sethos by the Abbé Terrasson. This neatly supports a distinction between the facts taught by Orthodox classicists and the fiction propounded by Afrocentrists. There's no doubt that many of the details and particulars of Masonic rites and initiations put forward in Stolen Legacy and other Afrocentrist writers do derive from this origin. Nevertheless, as Mary Lefkowitz is forced to concede, these novels were extremely learned and based on ancient Greek and Latin sources which stressed the Egyptian origin of Greek mysteries and wisdom. However, she feels able to dismiss writers like Herodotus as idiosyncratic, Diodorus, Strabo, and the other authors of the Hellenistic and Roman periods as late, which is somewhat startling coming from someone writing in the 20th century. She writes, "There never was such a thing as an Egyptian mystery system. The notion of mysteries or rituals of initiation is fundamentally Greek, and such information as we have about Egyptian mysteries dates from a period when Egypt had been occupied and influenced by both Greeks and Romans." Mysteries are by their nature mysterious and seldom, if ever, described directly. And it's also true that the two detailed descriptions of Egyptian initiations come from the Roman period. One is in the description in the Latin novel The Golden Ass, written by the North African author Apuleius, of an initiation to the goddess Isis that took place actually in Greece. The other is a papyrus in the Egyptian script of Hieratic, describing the initiations of a priest called Horsiesis, which took place in the ancient cult centers of Abydos, Busiris, and Karnak. There are three striking features about both sets of rituals. The first is that they appear to be based entirely on the Egyptian tradition. The second is that many of the passages resemble those found in the Going Forth by Day, or in the common title of the Book of the Dead. The third is that they parallel many of the rituals practiced in the most famous Greek mysteries, those at Eleusis, northwest of Athens. The very skeptical scholar, Professor Gwyn Griffiths, has attempted to reconcile these three parallels. He maintains that the essential theme of spiritual regeneration in the present life was specifically Greek and Eleusinian. Nevertheless, he feels obliged to add, yet this may have developed in the Hellenistic era in Egypt as a development and projection of a very ancient funerary tradition. His position seems then to be that the Greeks and late Egyptians both independently invented spiritual initiations for the living, resembling the journeys of the souls of the dead, and this situation was then confused by a widespread Egyptomaniac fantasy that the Greek mysteries had been developed from Egyptian ones, which was fleshed out by the introduction of some Egyptian ritual. This seems much more cumbersome than simply accepting the view of the ancients that the Greek mysterious initiations had derived from Egypt. At least at a superficial level, the cult and initiations of Demeter at Eleusis resembled those of Osiris at Abydos. Furthermore, Egyptian scarabs and a symbol of Isis, Demeter was her Greek counterpart, were found in a 9th or 8th century tomb at Eleusis. It is for these reasons that although a majority of classicists today deny it, a number of the most distinguished specialists in the Eleusinian mysteries in the 20th century have followed the predominant ancient tradition that the cult was imported from Egypt before the Trojan War, or during what we would now call the late Bronze Age. Most notable of these was Paul Foucault, who dominated Eleusinian studies in the early part of the century, whose detailed work is still respected even by the most conventional. Charles Picard is generally supposed to have refuted Foucault, but he admitted that well before the 8th century, the Eleusinian mysteries had received substantial influence from Egypt. In 1971, the British scholar A. A. Barr also saw fundamental connections. Even the firm isolationist Jean Anny admitted, when referring to Isis and Demeter, it seems that there's always been a type of understanding, connivence, between Greece and Egypt since prehistory. Mary Lefkowitz takes the line that spiritual rebirth in the present life was a uniquely Greek concept, and the Egyptian descriptions of voyages of the soul set out in Going Forth by Day were purely what they purported to be and had nothing to do with initiations. However, in addition to the evidence from Apuleius and Horsiasis, there is the mysterious underground cenotaph of Seti I, 1309 to 1291 BC, or what is otherwise known as the Osarion. This structure contains complex passages inscribed with broken hieroglyphs, sections of the Book of the Dead, a strange underground island with a hall decorated with the script of a mysterious religious play. It's very plausible to suggest that this was used for initiations. In addition to this, there are references going back at least to the 17th century BC to men who, though alive, were called Maharu, true of voice, which is a title generally applied to the immortal dead. There is even a description from a man who claimed to have taken part in a ritual described in Going Forth by Day. Thus, the balance of evidence indicates both that the Going Forth by Day was used for initiations of the living, and that we should accept the ancient view that the Greek mysteries and initiations associated with them derived from Egypt. I admit that these arguments are based not on certainty but on competitive plausibility. Nevertheless, it is ludicrous for Mary Lefkowitz to claim that her denial of Egyptian influence on Greek mysteries and initiations is based on warranted facts. The issue of whether I'm going on too long, am I?
No. I don't know, is it?
Can people? I mean, I've not got that much more, but I'll go on a bit more. Okay. The issue of whether colleges or universities at Memphis and other Egyptian cities depends on definition. It is known that at least since the Old Kingdom there was an elaborate bureaucracy of specialized scribes, doctors, and magicians, and that from the Middle Kingdom, circa 2000 BC, there was an institution known as the Per Ankh, the House of Life. Egyptologists have been divided on how to see this. Some, like Alan Gardner, describe it merely as a scriptorium, a place of restricted entry where some papyri were kept. Others have concluded it was a kind of university. For instance, Egyptologist P. Derchin maintained that by the first Persian period, these institutions contained papyri on subjects ranging from medicine, astronomy, mathematics, myths, embalming to geography, etc. Quote, "In a word, one ought to find there the complete totality of all the philosophical and scientific knowledge of the Egyptians." The subject is clearly still being debated, but equally clearly, Mary Lefkowitz is wrong to claim that the ancient 18th century and Afrocentrist description of Egyptian colleges is solely based on fiction. Did the ancient Egyptians possess a science? If they did it have any significant impact on the Greeks? For some years now, I and others have argued in favour of both claims, and I have presented my arguments on them to the departments of history and philosophy of science at both Harvard and Cambridge, the real one. Some of the audience agreed, but others did not. But these claims were clearly accepted as legitimate topics of scholarly debate. Here again, it is clear that Mary Lefkowitz is wrong to dismiss Afrocentric claims as absurd. This is not to say that Hellenistic science based in Greek-dominated Egypt did not add to what had been received from Egypt. The same is true of philosophy. The term philosophy is extraordinarily slippery, but taken in the sense of wonder or speculation on truth and reality, there is every reason to suppose that it was present in ancient Egypt. Indeed, it was conventional wisdom among the Greeks and Romans that philosophy had derived from Egypt. It's strange that James should have focused on Aristotle, whose thought does appear to be rather distinctively Greek, rather than on the pre-Socratics, the philosophers before Socrates, whom the classicist Geoffrey Kirk saw as having significantly been influenced by Egyptian and Mesopotamian ideas. Similarly, one can focus on Plato, who was clearly very impressed by Egypt, and for more than 2,000 years, his followers saw his thought as a glorious link in a chain leading back to Egypt. Mary Lefkowitz's conviction that there is a Mary Lefkowitz's conviction that there is a categorical distinction between rational Greece and irrational Egypt only holds if you believe that reason only begins with Aristotle's logic or Euclid's axiomatic geometry, neither of which existed as far as we know in ancient Egypt. However, it should be tempered by the works of scholars who thought about the issue more profoundly. The first of these is classicist E.R. Dodds, whose brilliant The Greeks and the Irrational showed the centrality of madness and shamanism to Greek life and thought. The second is the classicist and historian of science Henrik von Staden, who has emphasized how modern classicists have been extremely selective in choosing the rational Greek texts out of the mass of irrational ones. In Egypt, too, there were areas of rationality, sophisticated and rigorous mathematics, superb geometry, wonderfully observed medical symptoms, precise surgery, etc., amidst what we should now consider to be magic and superstition. Thus, Mary Lefkowitz's categorical distinction between the two cultures on this criterion is far less hard and fast than she supposes. Now to Mary Lefkowitz's ultimate bugbear, the Afrocentrist claim of a stolen legacy. As stated above, there have been mistakes. Furthermore, there is little chance that Greeks could have stolen ideas that the Egyptians do not appear to have possessed. Nevertheless, in general, the Afrocentrists are tapping into a tradition of great antiquity, and at least in the areas of religion and science of some validity. And then I give a series of ancient writers who accuse the Greeks of having stolen Egyptian texts, Egyptian ideas, science, the appropriations, calling Pythagorean triangles, the principle of triangle, right-angle triangle, which has been known for thousands of years in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, or Archimedes' balance scales and Archimedes' screw, which were in use in Egypt centuries before the Greek scientist was born. Academics might prefer the fashionable word appropriation, but the word stealing in such cases is not altogether inappropriate. At this point, I should like to set out the positions of both parties in a wider historical context. Though there have been a number of deformations, Afrocentrists have maintained what in Black Athena I have called the ancient model of Greek origins. Since at least the 5th century BC, Greeks and others believed that people coming from Egypt, Phoenicians and other Asiatics, came to Greece, built cities, established royal dynasties, introduced religion and the mysteries. Later, Greeks studied in Egypt and to a lesser extent in the Orient, importing philosophy, mathematics and science. The particular branch of the ancient model taken up by the Afrocentrists was that prominent at the turn of the 19th century, around 1800. This was partly based on the Masonic tradition and the novels, but also on the work of scholars such as Charles-François Dupuy, Constantin de Volney and A.H.L. Heron. The latter three maintained that the ancient Egyptians had been black, or nearly so, and that the Europeans had derived their civilization from Africans. And these arguments were used by abolitionists throughout the 19th century in their attacks on race-based slavery. This shift of emphasis within the ancient model was nowhere near as drastic as the categorical break or coupure that followed after 1820. In which it was in this period, these 25 years from 1820 to 1845, that the modern discipline of classics was formed. In this period, young scholars dismissed the ancient model and denied the ancient traditions of massive Greek cultural borrowings from Egypt. Their dismissal was not the result of the decipherment of hieroglyphics, as these classicists only accepted Champollion's work in the 1850s, nor did it come from archaeological excavations, because these were not of Bronze Age Greece, because these were not carried on to the 1870s. The ancient model was dismissed for ideological reasons. It was not seemly for Greece, now seen as the cradle of Europe, to have been civilized by Africans and Asians who were known, according to the new racial science, to be categorically inferior. In the 1840s, a new Aryan model arose, according to which Greek civilization had emerged from a conquest or conquest from the north by Aryan or Indo-European speaking Hellenes. These had dominated the previous inhabitants of the Aegean. Now, there's no reason why the fact that Greek is fundamentally an Indo-European language should not be combined with the ancient model's multiple reports of Egyptian and Semitic influences. However, such cultural and linguistic mixture was intolerable to the Romantic racists who dominated classics and established the Aryan model, and who, like Mary Lefkowitz today, insisted that there be no significant Egyptian influence on Greece. This raises an amusing irony. Mary Lefkowitz reiterates Arthur J. Schlesinger's charge that Afrocentrist history is purely an attempt to promote group self-esteem, whereas history should, quote, consist of dispassionate analysis, judgment, and perspective. In fact, this is very far from the way in which history is taught in schools, where the nation or locality is always emphasized and placed above that of others. For instance, when I was sent to France, at the age of 17, my French companion and I compared a list of battles between the English and the French, and we knew a completely different sequence. I knew the English victories, he knew the French ones. Thus, for African American children to be taught about African and diasporic triumphs is not unusual and is particularly useful given the constant mental battering they receive in a racist society. On the other hand, I agree with Schlesinger and Lefkowitz that historical researchers should try to transcend their own environments and achieve objectivity as far as possible. However, the ancient Aryan model, that's the new model on which classics is based, with its denial of ancient tradition and its insistence on a purely white, purely European Greece, is an extreme example of feel-good scholarship and education for white. It's a feel-good education for whites. Mary Lefkowitz ends her last chapter with George Orwell's description of a systematic destruction of the old culture going on in his fictional 1984. This, he said, would be completed by 2050, by which time the old culture would be obliterated. She continues, what Orwell predicted for 2050 actually happened a century earlier with the publication of Stolen Legacy in 1954. For in that book, George G.M. James rewrote ancient history so drastically that it became both different from and contradictory to what it had previously been. She's mistaken by more than a century. For all his errors, James was maintaining the ancient historical tradition. It was the founders of the Aryan model to which Mary Lefkowitz adheres who made the categorical break with all previous history of the formation of ancient Greece. Thank you very much.
This is the book, Not Out of Africa, by Mary Lefkowitz. It has what looks like a Greek statue with a Malcolm X hat on it. If you get an opportunity to read it, read it. Don't buy it. I felt that Martin Bernal had to take some time because he had to defend himself. Because folks who talk about this are under constant attack in the media, particularly with some of these right-wing think tanks that have put out books like this and like The Bell Curve, and that they have to be refuted because these books are taken and they're run with and they wind up being interpreted into national policy a lot of times. So we have to take the kind of time to kind of break it down. One of the things I like about the individuals that are on the stage today is that they, in the tradition of some of the modern folks that have come together, like Molefi Asante and Ivan Van Sertima, they don't just come shouting about it's this way, it's that way. They come with their documentation, and they're always ready to challenge and present it in an open forum. And at every opportunity, these folks try to avoid that kind of open forum. So if any of you know Mary Lefkowitz, I know a radio station that would sit down with her and Martin Bernal and have that kind of forum. So if you could arrange that, please do. We now move to Professor Emeritus Dr. John Henrik Clarke. You know him, huh?
He's the man.
He is the author and editor of over 30 books. His latest effort is Who Betrayed the African Revolution? He is someone who, one of those people, like, I just saw Lambe Breath come in, who you try and figure out just where does this energy come from? Because whenever you ask them to do anything, they think about it a moment, and then they say, okay. And I don't know where it, wherever it may be, they work out a way of getting there and sharing this information. And I'm just glad that I've had an opportunity to also work with John Henrik Clarke, who was one of the key pieces in a piece that we did a couple of months ago called The Middle Passage that was inspired by the book put together by Tom Field. So, without any further ado, Professor Clarke will be coming to you.
We have a lot of work to do, and there isn't enough time. First, I want you to bear in mind that we live in a Eurocentric intellectual universe. They have not only colonized history, they've colonized information about history. Then they colonize something else that is absolute disaster in our lives. They colonize image, the image of God. In their arrogance, they dare you to look at God as something that resembles you. And religiously, they have projected a program of media that gives you the idea that everything of achievement, of holiness, had to resemble them. My focus is not going to be on the so-called Afrocentrics. I did not accept the word in the first place because it is a compromise with the word Africa. There is no Afro in Africa. I have no argument with what the so-called Afrocentrics are trying to do in most cases until some charlatans entered their camp. But if you talk about charlatans in the black intellectual camp, you've got to talk about charlatans in the white intellectuals camp. And I maintain that Professor Lestwitz is a charlatan and a hypocrite. Now, in the scramble to put Africa outside of history, they have made people investigate their history. And they have neglected their own writers who sustain the fact that great civilizations existed outside of Europe. The European was the last of the massive people of the world to come into that arena marked civilization. Now don't get mad, get smart. Prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. That civilizations existed in other parts of the world, organized structure, organized social thought, organized society, collective society, the forerunner of what Karl Marx would later call socialism, that they existed outside of Europe before the first European wore a shoe or lived in a house that had a window. Now, why this war? We're talking about a world war. And that world war is mainly directed against African people. If you admit the achievements of African people before the European contact, and if you admit the fact that the total relationship of Europeans to non-Europeans has been a protracted act of aggression and still is. Now, if you admit this, you will put your worthiness to rule the world up to question. And this is what it's about. Now, who did what when, but an image that the Europeans created of themselves in the 15th and the 16th century that projected a concept that the world waited in darkness for them to bring the light. And even their own historians that they neglect have proven that with the entry of Europeans into non-European civilization, the light went out. Things that we have not dealt with. Their own scholars that they have not dealt with. They have not dealt with Joe Massey, 6-volume work, Egypt, Light of the World, 2 volumes. Natural Genesis, 2 volumes. Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. They haven't dealt with the 3 major German observers of Africa before German colonialism here in 1830s, in his interesting volume, A History of the Commercial Intercourse Between the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, and the Carthaginians. And if you get the book, read his opening chapter on the Carthaginians. He said, we decry the fact that the history of Carthage is told mostly by travelers, freebooters, and conquerors. And he wondered, what would the Carthaginians have to say about the destruction of Carthage had they written it other than the conqueror? You have a Roman account of the conquest. You have no Carthaginian account. The other German who called our attention to a lot of this and what was happening, but mostly his focus was in Central Africa, Henrik Clarke, Travels and Discoveries in North and in Central Africa. When he appraised the last aspect of the Songhai Empire and its emperor as one of the great civil administrators of all time. Why have we neglected what these pioneer whites in revolt against the European concept said about the people Europeans had marked for oppression and a people without achievement? Why haven't we devoted some time to Frobenius' 5-volume work, The History of African Civilization, condensed into 2 volumes called The Voice of Africa? What I'm trying to say is that Professor Leskowitz do not understand that these radical European historians set the radical black historians in motion. And if she wants to accuse anyone, read them with care and attack them, not us. Because of the Europeans' insecurity and sick ego, he had to walk through the earth parading himself as the conqueror of all things and the great achiever. And if you read a book, Colson and Palmer, dealing with the early development of Europe, they said there was no Europe in ancient times. Europe emerged in the world on the eve of the modern era. Now, what I'm trying to say is that Colson and Palmer again said, while the Egyptians were building the pyramids, Europe was building nothing more magnificent than a garbage heap. But now this is the white interpretation that whites choose to ignore. They had not achieved anything of that note. I trace intellectual thought in Europe from the Odyssey and the Iliad because there is nothing of great consequence in intellectual thought before that. And if there is, somebody point it out to me. And this is a piece of folklore created by a man named Homer. It could have been a man or a woman. And it's folklore. It showed that misconceptions of Africans. The Africans appear in the text as 10 feet tall with one big eye in the middle. A misleading caricature, but not exactly a slander. Now, what I'm asking Professor Lefkowitz and others, why don't you read what other Europeans said about us? Because at the time they were saying this about us, you had programmed us into slavery in the 15th and the 16th century, and we wasn't writing books or writing at all until there developed a cadre of free Africans in New England who began to publish newspapers, write books. But this was the first half of the 19th century. And this African disaster called slavery was already 400 years old. Now among the Arabs, and this is a sensitive subject because most people are absolute hypocrites when they come discussing any religion. Slavery had started 1,000 years before the Europeans entered West Africa in the 15th and the 16th century.
Talk about it.
Because we cannot distinguish between Arabism and Islam. We are confused and we often wash their hands of their sins while pointing to others. But when it comes to slavery, they are just as guilty as anyone else. Let me make one thing very clear. I am not into the Farrakhan bashing of the Jews or the Jews bashing of Farrakhan. In this regard, I think both of them are hypocrites. And have rendered a disservice to their respective people. Because both those people need each other. Because the wind is rising against both of them. And if anyone say the African people have ever been the traditional enemies of the Jews, they are liars to history because we have always had a sentimental attachment to the Jewish people. We read their history and we believe it. You can get black people to cry right now over the 3 Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace. Daniel in the lion's den. We have a hard time distinguishing between folklore and fact and fable. And many stories told to illustrate faith are told for that reason alone, to illustrate the power of faith. But don't you play no damn fool and get into a lion's den. Or a fiery furnace unless you got enough water to put the fire out. I'm not saying this is wrong. We grew up telling fairy tales about great black heroes because in our weakness, in our literally being trapped, we created characters like John Henry who could do anything, stop a train. We created High John the Conqueror. And anytime we can't defend ourselves, we can't respond to pressure over and above anything we can deal with, we can bring out High John the Conqueror. Man, did you see High John kick that crowd's ass? Ran like a jackrabbit. Now we know, at least we know it is a lie. Visitors to Africa copied a lot of African folklore and folk stories, personified them, embellished them, and called it their own. If you read, there's a 3-volume work from University of Chicago on Egyptian literature, you can find the stories that were later rewritten and personified and went into the literature of other people. You find the original story of the people flooding the water, partying. One day a pharaoh was a little despondent, and he decided that his magician would take him down the Nile. And so to make him more happy, all the rowers were beautiful women. Then the lead lady started crying and stopped the boat. The Pharaoh asked his magician, and it was tradition in that you always carry a magician with you, what has happened? He said, the girl dropped her necklace in the Nile. He said, well, take care of it. And so the magician parted the water, made everything dry, got up from the dry ground, picked up a necklace, handed it to her, the water came back, keep rolling, the Pharaoh's happy. Now this story, 2,000 years before the Exodus.
Teach.
For people visiting Africa, copied African stories and personified themselves into the stories. Now, the argument between what Egypt did and what Greek did is easy to argue and easy to settle if you understand basic logic. I can prove that Greece and Rome was not European creations, because at the time of Greece and Rome there was no functioning Europe. Then what is it that every Scandinavian schoolboy, a British minor, can claim Greece and Rome as his heritage, when at the time of Greece and Rome they didn't exist as a functioning political people? The Nile Valley stretches 4,000 miles into Africa. It was a great cultural highway. The people from the lower, that part of the Nile, migrated down the Nile and established the country that the Greeks called Egypt. Egypt was, and still is to some extent, a composite nation made up of many people, different climates, different skills. They became the beneficiary of the greatest body of skillful labor yet to be assembled. All of this before there was a Europe. How can the Europeans say that they came and built the pyramid when right now they not only can't build one, they can't even tear one down? Now when Professor Lesko accused me of not paying attention to historical chronology, she never could be more wrong, but that's exactly what I do. Read one of my curriculums. What's the opening lesson? Africa and the origin of man. The second lesson, the beginning of organized societies. Now, the unification of the upper and the lower Nile. The creation of family rule called dynasty. I am clear that A comes first and B comes second. And if you read a book called New Dimensions in African History, one of the longest curriculums on Africa in world history that has so far been published is right in the back of the book, and it all came from me. Now, what people are trying to justify is today, right now. It's all about today. If the African understood what he had done previously before the European contact, he would reclaim his mineral wealth today. He would cut his own diamonds today. So long as you prove to him that he is a person of no achievement and lackeys and European trained flunkies with European minds and African bodies rule African nations, then you can rape Africa day by day and get away with it because they are told there are people with no achievement. Now, if you look at Rome and Greece at a time there was no organized states in the rest of Europe, and if you are honest, you would say that Rome and Greece were Mediterranean-inspired nations and not European creations, because the challenge to Rome and Greece created Europe. All right. Don't get mad now. Get smart. Prove me wrong. Rome and Greece became a threat to the rest of Europe. Opposing Rome and Greece brought the tribes of Europe together for self-defense. And out of this togetherness came some form of community-ness in an organized European state. If you know any information to the contrary, present it to me. Well, I'm saying that Rome and Greece was not only not European states, they were Mediterranean-inspired states, and that the challenge of Rome and Greece made them come together and form a state. Before Caesar went to war with the Gauls were at war with themselves to the extent that they couldn't get a state together. But once Caesar came over and did his butt kicking, they said, hell, we better stop this internal thing and get together, but damn Romans may come back here. The same thing about the Franks. You should read an honest history of Europe. Now, my interest in this subject began when I was doing chores in the South, and when I wanted to write something to impress the 5th grade teacher, because on Friday we had current events and all the other kids had one single event from the white paper always published at least one single event about some professional black. We got to recite the thing over and over again. While I excelled and I worked for white people before and after school, when they threw out Cosmopolitan magazine, Old Liberty magazine, the Atlanta Constitution, I mean, I had a wide range of things to draw current events from. But I had excelled in that regard. Now I wanted to do something way back. And I asked the white man that I worked for, I can still remember, Gary Stiker. He's a lawyer, a good man. If he's alive today, and I doubt it, he's earned his liberal label, capital L, of course. When I asked him about African people in ancient history, he, as we say in southern phrases, let me down slow. He says, John, I'm sorry. You came from a people who have no history. He said, well, don't you worry. If you persevere, obey the law, keep yourself clean and presentable, you might make history one day. He said, I might one day be a great Negro like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the approved black man of the day. I didn't know that much about him other than the fact that before my mother died, she was saving 50 cents a week and told me that I'm going to Tuskegee even if she had to pick me up in her arms and take me there. That was her wish and her hope for me. Now, after my mind revolted against the idea of people with no history, And after I was already in trouble by asking some questions about the Bible, especially the white angels, and people telling me God is just and God is love, and I wanted, they didn't let a little brown or black angel sneak in to help me. So this gets me into trouble with my predominantly Baptist family. The Sunday school text said this, that's God's word, is not to be questioned. God will remove the veil from our eyes and take the curse off of us. I just couldn't buy it. Because to make God a curser is to make God ungodly. And to make God having chosen people, that means he has unchosen people. And I didn't believe that God had any stepchildren. Now, finally doing chores at a Rosenwald High School because, well, we won't get too deep in this. The dark-skinned kids did the chores and the light-skinned kids appeared in the plays and, you know. So I, being of that hue, was doing the chores, holding the code and books of a reciter. Still remember his name, Jones. The school was so new they didn't even have a curtain. He was raising some money where we could buy a curtain. So he had a book called The Negro Digs, called The New Negro. I opened to an essay by Arthur Schomburg, who called himself a Puerto Rican of African descent. Right. For the first time reading this essay, I concluded we were older than slavery, older than our oppressor, and that we were already old before Europe was born. I got smug. I started walking through the street and looking at white people with my nose in there. Bless the Lord, you just got here. But this led me to move to Harlem, to talk with Schomburg, membership in the Old Harlem History Club. Nkrumah was a member as a student. The confrontation with Schomburg, when I went to his office one midday, I had asked to go downstairs because I thought he was some kind of a high priest. People guarding his knowledge. Will you give me a letter? Ain't nobody will give me a letter to see Arthur Schomburg. And she was short-tempered. It was her lunch hour too. People asked her, you just have to walk 3 flights. So I walked up 3 flights. There, Arthur Schomburg, holding down the whole library by himself with his staff at lunch. And I told him, I'm 18 years old now. I want to know the whole history of African people and Negro people. All of it, henceforth, within the hour, his lunch hour. He said, sit down, son. What you call a Negro history and African history, or the missing page, is a world history. He said, son, go study your masters. Study the people who took you out of history. Yes. And why they cannot be secure with you knowing an equal amount of your history as they know of their history. I began with an old chestnut, still worth reading if you can find it. H.G. Wells' Outline of History. It is Eurocentric point of view, but his chronology and his basic facts about the events in history are correct. His interpretation is solely racist. So long as you give me the right information, I can use my own analysis of the information. That you cannot afford to parade yourself as the ruler of the world and as the monopolizer of all achievements, and also admit that there were other people of achievement in the world, both in Africa and in Asia, who did not start campaigns against the European, because modern racism as such is a European invention. People did not address themselves as white or black. This is why the confusion over Egypt is that why would Europe come out of Europe and build a civilization like Egypt when they hadn't even built a shoe for themselves? It makes no kind of sense. Now let's turn to white writers on this subject. During that great school of living Oriental languages in France, and two fine translators, Houdard and Deslane, turn to the French pioneers in the subject, Delafosse and Maspero. Why don't we learn what Europeans said about Europeans and the lies that Europe was telling the world and still telling the world? Why don't we study the English with some kind of sense of thoroughness? And why can't we study not only Gerald Massey, but Gerald Massey's British disciple wrote Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, Alvin Chechwad, and Origin of Religions. Then study Gerald Massey's American disciple, Alvin Boyd Q. Study his book, Who is This King of Glory? When he shows precisely, other than what you think is modern Christianity, the concepts of saints was a direct steal from African texts. Now why don't somebody, especially Ms. Leskowitz, argue with those scholars, those European scholars? Read his book, The Lost Christianity, and read another work, Shadow of the 3rd Century. Why are Europeans paying so much little attention to those who have repudiated the European concept that the world waited in darkness for them to bring to light? Why haven't we had a good examination of the North African church? Because the North African church developed after the exploitation and the aggressiveness of Rome. Then finally the Romans stopped killing Christians and became Christians. But he manifested a trait that all Europeans manifest today, whether they are left or right, politically. No matter what, they must be in charge. The communists wanted to rule you as much as the capitalists, but not the same way. They differed in methodology. But there's an overall basic European program. 2 world wars hadn't changed. They want to rule everything non-European on this earth, especially the resources. Right. Why then would Africa go through the charade of being free, and in South Africa, a great diamond producing country, with not one African diamond cutter? Who monopolizes the wealth of Southern Africa? Right. Europeans still. And you think Nelson Mandela controls the country. He don't even control his chauffeur. One of the reasons you have illusions about nations, because you don't know what a nation's supposed to consist of. Once you take an inventory of a nation, you must take an inventory of the needs of a nation. Dare you call yourself free when somebody else is making your shoes, making the pin that hold your child's diaper together. The new slavery in Africa is worse than the old slavery, because the African people have not understood only the slave can free the slave, and emancipation is a myth. Now, in the 19th century, with the development of free blacks in the Caribbean and free blacks in New England, they began to publish newspapers, read books. Our first novelist, William Wells Brown, began to write a book on Ethiopia. Martin Delaney began to ask some serious questions about the role of the blacks in human civilization. He went out to Nigeria to search for a place with the Jamaican Robert Campbell. Martin Delaney was a Harvard man. His report was a Harvard man's report. The sentences were declaratory and properly punctuated. The I's were dotted, the T's were crossed. In that same book called Search for a Place, read the report of Robert Campbell, Pilgrimage to My Motherland. No man has written a finer tribute to the continent that gave his people birth. It's rough-hewed poetry, but great poetry. Where he has to break in affinity to get his point across, he just goes ahead and breaks it and keeps on writing. He's one of the neglected Caribbean freedom fighters that made a contribution to our civilization, to our being and our maintenance. Now, the European challenge of dominance came late in the 18th century in the presence of a Barbadian Prince Hall. And when he found a black Masonic order, he did not call it Black Mason. He did not use the word black. Black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. Part of the misinterpretation of African history is the use of this word black. People said, the Egyptians were not black, they were not black, they were not black. I said they were people of African culture, and there is no proof that they were Indo-European people. I didn't argue with that color because color wasn't a factor at that time in history. You've got a branch of the Zulus who are light in complexion. And you got a black branch of the Zulus who are dark in complexion. But they are both of African culture. And the light-skinned Zulu is not a mixture of the Arabs or the whites. So we're not arguing color, we argue culture. It was wrong to argue color in the first place. 80 people from Western Asia comes into North Africa, and they attribute all the civilization of North Africa in the early medieval and late medieval time to these Europeans. Asians invaded Europe in the hundreds and thousands and never went home. They did not go home for the physical necessity that all men think they cannot possibly do without. So if I said all of the Spaniards, all of the Italians, part of the French are Mediterranean mulattoes, I am true by the standard of racism that the Europeans said. They said one drop of us makes you a whole of us. So next time you see Cousin Promo, now, I'm going to try to conclude something that has no conclusion. Because after the fakery called emancipation in the Caribbean islands and in the United States, we fell into some illusions that we have not extracted ourselves from to this day. To attack Edmund Blythe is not to understand him in his inaugural address 1881 at Liberia College, he prophesied the whole concept of black studies, which should never been called black in the first place. And he said that we should have to work for many years to come without the support that we need. We fancy that we must feed grist into other people's meals, and we admire those things most unlike ourselves. Nothing comes out except what has been put in. That then is our great sorrow. He's speaking in 1881. He was not only ahead of his time, he was ahead of this time. He wrote a book on Palestine that if properly read, you might understand the tragedy of the Arab-Israeli conflict. If you properly understand his book on Palestine, his book on African customs, he was asking Africans to do at the end of the 19th century what Africans are not only not doing today, but retreating from. Preserve yourself first and foremost. Be not ashamed of taking care of your kith and care. The African wants to be too many things, unlike himself. African clothes don't suit him. African traditions don't suit him. And another tragedy, the OJ syndrome, African women don't suit him. What I'm saying is that this awareness in the 19th century by Blyden, Delaney, Campbell, Ruswan, rebel ministers like Henry Highland Garnet, who said, my motto is resistance, resistance. And near the end of the 19th century, George Washington Williams published the first formal history of Africans in the United States. His book is still worth reading. He argued about whether he should use the word Negro, but he thought if he didn't use it, he wouldn't be understood. Read his book on the history, the early history of Negro America. And read his argument, because that argument has been settled today. This is why I take some exception to the word Afrocentricity, because that's not what it is about. It's about the restoration of a people to their proper place in history. We are not trying to take other people out of history. We're trying to look at history in proper focus. We will never erase this people. Even the sloppy rantings of Farrakhan, it probably is not racist. It's just misguided rhetoric. And yet, someone asked me 2 days ago to compare Farrakhan with Malcolm X. And my answer wouldn't please most of you. Because I said, if Farrakhan worked hard at it and improved himself for 20 years, he still wouldn't be worthy of cleaning the shoes of Malcolm X. Now, early in the century, we would produce men like William Leo Hansberry, 37 years at Howard University. Nobody heard him then, nobody hearing him now. Snowden, a misguided black white man. But Hansberry would be the pioneer Africanist in the Western world, for the pioneer Africanists in Africa. Would be a man from the Virgin Islands, Edmund Biltmore Blythe. Earlier in the century, a nation called Ghana began to produce literature of liberation, and if read, Ghana would be a free nation instead of being a colony of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Because they would know how to take care of themselves without getting into foreign debt. Literature of liberation on land, case of Hayford, whose mentor who mentored Danquah, Joseph B. Danquah, who subsequently was the mentor of Kwame Nkrumah. According to tradition, the line was to move down from one to the other. And Danquah was training Nkrumah to take over the nation. They argued about how it was to be taken over. And Nkrumah had spent so much time in the West. In the meantime, Zekeism in Nigeria was on the decline because Zeke had built the only nationwide political party. The other parties were regional. Zeke is still alive. He's 90. But he could have been and should have been the primary politician in all Africa, even before the emergence of Nkrumah, who he knew and partly trained. We began to challenge the concept of the treatment of African history. And in Montreal, 25 years ago, at a meeting of the African Studies Association, a committee of blacks dissatisfied with the use that's being made of African history by blacks who were agents of the government challenged them for parity, equality in the interpretation. This led to the founding of the African Heritage Studies Association, calling for an interpretation of African history from an African point of view. This ultimately would go into the making of a concept called Black Studies, a poor title in the first place, because it wasn't about Black Studies, it was about world studies, and to show African people in relationship to the world. And if you did this, you would show how the Caribbean islands, especially Jamaica and Haiti, literally rescued the economy of Europe, and how African slavery and the profit from slavery helped to make the modern scientific and technical world. Now you think if a black child knew this, he would be copied out in school? You think he would talk about mathematics being hard when we invented it? Now all that brick, all those stones, and buildings built 6,000 years ago, they didn't fall down, so there must have been some competence someplace. They laid forth the social thought that ultimately went into the making of the Bible and moral laws. They had nations with no sociologists because they didn't need any sociologists. Modern day sociology was brought into being to correct the errors in European life. And sane aside, social work. Oh, and I defy you to prove me wrong. All right. Why didn't we have social worker? Because all of this was embedded in the family structure itself. You had an internal Supreme Court within the family. And your uncle or your grandfather could be head of the Supreme Court. And once those elders made a decision, there was no reprieve. There was no word for prostitution because no one had ever been one. All these degenerate farms came into Africa when they became in contact with foreigners, fakers, and fools. For 2,000 years, Africa's enemies came from Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East. And for another 1,000 years, it came from Europe. No one came into Africa to do African people any good. There's no achievement in Africa that be contributed to the outsider's influence, because they began to demean, bastardize, and confuse African societies, because these societies were collective. In a collective society, this was the forerunner of what would later be called socialism. The European had never wanted to live in this kind of society. Now, at the conference at Nicaea, 325 AD, they took the North African church and refashioned it to suit their own imperial designs. Read the book, Roman Africa, and read the North African chapters in J.C. DeGrasse Johnson's book, African Glory. And what they set in motion by way of corruption and confusion made the Africans question old gods and look for new gods. And they looked into their folklore and their folk culture. The Europeanizing of an African faith was disaster for the Africans, because at Nicaea they put the books on the Bible on the table, and they said that the books God don't want us to deal with will be gone in the morning. So the lost books of the Bible got lost. I don't know how lost they are. I've got them all in my own library. These were the books they didn't want to deal with. They didn't want to deal with the Immaculate Conception that they had invented. They did not want to deal with the African concept of the Immaculate Conception. It has nothing to do with whether a woman has been physically entered or not. The African can see a woman with 9 children. If her reputation is good, and she is honorable and kept her promise and lived in a way that the community respects her,
Yes.
the African will say that her skirt is clean, her mouth is sweet, she is virgin. So when you accept somebody else's interpretation of what is a virgin, you accept someone else's interpretation, what is sin? You haven't asked a critical question. Why is that sin? In the tyranny of words, the Europeans have imperialized the language. And you live in a European conceived universe. And you live with a European dictionary. Everything means what he says it means. Now, Professor Leskowitz's problem is that once the African understands what has happened to him and how he's being programmed in disaster, not only by the Europeans, but by certain Asians too.
That's right.
It will not that Africa is short of friends in this world. And once the European understands that he may be less than 10% of the population in the world, and he controls probably 80% of the wealth of the world. Communism didn't exactly fall, it was betrayed. It was a promise held out for the working class people of the world. Why don't we understand that we must practice the essential selfishness of survival? And that does not make us racist. We need to take care of our children, train people to take care of the wealth of Africa. We need a leader to step forth and say, I will not ride in a Mercedes-Benz until my people make a Mercedes-Benz. Then you create an industry. I will not wear any shoes my people didn't make. Got another industry. I will not eat any bread that didn't come from one of their farms. Now you got advanced agriculture. Our mind has been programmed into wishing for the trinkets of our oppressor. There is no permanent place in his society for you except to clean his house, to give sex on demand, and to program you into destroying each other. So long as that program functions for him, your chances of reclaiming all of Africa, including the Arab part, your chances of understanding that all the religions of consequence that you worship was brought in by conquerors, and you make no mistake by discarding them. If you cannot change them into forms of revolution, then you should throw them into the ash can of history and not look back. I will end with this. Willis and Huggins in the Old Harlem History Club, he says, John, we will have no problem getting to the door of the promised land. But we will bunch up at the door and start an argument about whether to cross the threshold with our right foot or our left. It's a terrible thing for people to be out of power so long. They forget how they once ruled power.
That's right.
He said, once we understand crossing the threshold of freedom does not depend on whether it's done with the left foot or the right foot, so long as you get crossed. We have to stop this silly argument among ourselves about who came from what oppressor. We must stop this comparative study of slave masters. My slave master better than your slave master. If you're against all slave masters, then there is no better. If you're against evil, you do not make a choice between two evils if you're against evil at all. We better look in the mirror and find ourselves and find our partner in a revolution, a culture revolution, a world revolution. We are going to have to fight and win if we're going to remain or become a sovereign people on this earth. Once we find our friend, ourselves, and declare our revolutionary intent, we can look back into our history and say, there was a time when history was young. We gave the world a new humanity. There is no reason why, if we did it once, we can't do it again. Thank you.
Okay, you all have your homework assignments. And when we assemble, you can just pass them forward when we reassemble. There are quite a few folks here this evening. We are going to take some questions. They are going to take some questions. But I would like to acknowledge some of the folks that I've identified. Alambe Brandt is here, member of the Patrice Lumumba Coalition. Someone who I've gotten to meet lately, although I used to see them all the time when I was younger, and got to know him as just Grandpa, Al Lewis, who is Grandpa amongst us here. Gerald Frazier, journalist. Serge Mukendi, who's I think he's going to be going back to Zaire, which is renamed with the Congo, which is renamed Zaire. Ms. Van Sertimer was here. Some more, and of course you. This is it's very good to see that so many people have come out this evening to hear from these two individuals. Professor Ron Carew was also expected, but he was unable to make it this evening. He has a new book out called Rape of Paradise, something that you might find very important. Also, there's going to be another program this tomorrow at the Oberia Dempsey Center, which is 127 West 127th Street, and it's on the history of Pan-Africanism, the potential or perversion of a revolutionary idea. And I would imagine that there would be some discussion from about some prominent individuals' trips to Africa and who they've met with and what does that all mean. And that's going to take place tomorrow evening at 6:30 p.m. at Oberia Dempsey Center, 127 West 127th Street. Which microphones are going to be used? Is the middle in the middle? Remember the book, Not Out of Africa? Murray Lefkowitz, How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History?
Yes.
Read it, but don't buy it. There's also a petition going around to contact Janet Reno concerning the trial of Mumia Abu Jamal, and I'm sure that most of you know who that is. So if you get an opportunity to sign this petition and read the material, please do so. If you have any questions, there's a mic that's set up right in the middle aisle. And the elderly person that's at the mic, I guess you could ask a question.
Salutations. I'd like to know, Dr. Clarke, when you'll be speaking and where you'll be speaking again.
Well, I was scheduled to speak tomorrow. I didn't like it.
My mic's not on.
It's one of these now.
I was scheduled to speak tomorrow at the Dempsey Center, and I was also scheduled to be at First World. I was too humble, right?
So he'll be speaking at the Dempsey Center tomorrow. That's at 6:30. He'll be there with Samori Marksman, Serge Mukendi, Viola Plummer, Banji Ayaloji.
Address?
127 West 127th Street. Take the 2 or the 3 to 125th Street, take the A, the C, or the D, 125th Street, walk to 127th Street, and say, where's Oberia Dempsey? And they'll send you there. Yes, sir.
Yes, Dr. Clarke. People keep accusing some of our leaders of being anti-Semitic. So what I did was looked up the word Semitic to see what it meant. And it says Semites are people who speak the Semitic language. And that what it later referred you to do was to check out the word Afro-Asiatic. When I went into Afro-Asiatic, they started identifying nations in the Middle East, which used to be called Northern Africa, as well as other parts of Africa extending from West Africa all the way over to the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia. So, since Afro-Asiatic is actually Semitic, how could the Africans be anti-Semitic when they're talking about themselves? Can you explain that to me?
They can't really, I don't agree with all the nonsense about anti-Semitic. First place, I'm not too clear what a Semitic is. And I'm not too clear what a Semitic is, and I don't think anybody else is either. It first appeared as a linguistic term. And all the cultism around anti-Semitic is, in addition to being current, but by my definition, inasmuch as you centered the Semitics in Western Asia, Northern Africa, before the infusion of Europeans, I question whether you can be white and Semitic or European and Semitic. So if I'm anti-Semitic, I'm anti-myself, inasmuch as Semitic languages include African languages also. I deploy this cultism around the subject and around the myth of black anti-Semitic, because I've done a paper 10, 20 years ago called The Myth of Black Anti-Semitism. And I maintain that when people are looking for an enemy, they find a weak one, and they beat up on him to impress their oppressor.
Could I come in on this?
Sure.
Briefly? Is my mic on? It is. Okay. In white academia, the term Afro-Asiatic is a larger language family that includes Semitic. Semitic is a subset of Afro-Asiatic. Afro-Asiatic also includes languages like Berber or Hausa or Somali, which are not Semitic languages but are part of the Afro-Asiatic language family. And all of these languages have been influenced by West African and other African languages. It's called Afro-Asiatic, not Afro-Asiatic or whatever it could do, because most of the members of the Afro-Asiatic language family are entirely in Africa. One Semitic is in both Africa and Asia, but so that they are two different things or within the same circle. Anti-Semitism is usually used just to mean anti-Jewish, which is a misnomer because the Arabs speak a Semitic language as well.
Professor Dr. Clarke and Dr. Bernard, thank you very much for the lecture. I enjoyed it very much. I am from a socialist country and grew up on this, so we always learned that everything what the Greeks and Romans, or most of the things what the Greeks and Romans learned, they learned from a much older civilization, the African. This sentence was at the end of each chapter. And my question is only for you, that if you knew about this, that in socialist countries was taught this, what you are teaching today, 35 years ago. Thank you.
Yeah. Before I knew the word socialism or communism, I was clearly born one. Sharecropper's son, backwood of Alabama. My father, the largest sum he ever made in 1 week was $18. We lost our land for a $12 debt. So when I came to New York and was introduced to socialism and communism, it was a fascination for me because it was part of something we had practiced to survive in backwood Alabama. Cooperative farming and helping each other. It was time for that farmer's corn to be taken in. All the families got together and took that one's corn in. No money exchange. And potatoes, got the potatoes, all. And took everybody's potatoes and corn was in the bin. And when we had weddings, there was no such thing as an invitation, because if you're part of the community, you're invited. And so there were certain communal aspects to our life and survival backwards Alabama, then in Georgia. That fit into the scheme of what people were later, what the Europeans would be later called socialism and communism. I just don't think the Europeans invented everything. But these societies function better outside of Europe before the European interference and the European interpretation of them. I don't see anything basically wrong with socialism and communism right now. But I see something wrong with the arrogance of the European thinking that he must always be the interpreter of it when he has never lived through it as much as non-European people. They've created societies without dogma that live through the same practices and advocacy as socialism and communism. But not too many European countries have lived through it. The Scandinavians, partly now, but only partly. They're still a basic capitalist nation. I don't understand, even our own commentators, well known, who said that slavery destroyed capitalism when it was the other way around. But people become deities because they speak well and have exposure to communication. But we don't understand the African people have never had any strong argument with the rest of the world. And African people have existed throughout the world. I don't know why it is so difficult for people to read the three main issues of the Journal of African Civilization. Africans in early Europe, Africans in early Asia, Africans in early America, and the revised editions, because I think the authors and the editor, Professor Van Settle, and the authors we assembled have more or less proved the point that African people are universal.
That's right.
And they're scattered throughout the world, and that there's more than 1 billion of us on the face of the earth if we are properly counted. So you can understand when somebody goes to Libya and want to accept $1 billion for Arab-African unity. That's less than $1 a piece. We're not for sale at that price.
Okay, next.
Yes, I'd like to direct this question to Dr. Bernard. And usually in all axiology, we treat our guests quite friendly. However, I see the need to question you about what I would like to call Mary Lefkowitzian type of error. In the introduction of your presentation, in the middle ground and in the background of your presentation, you noted that G.M. James made many errors in his work, or some errors in his work. I would be remiss if I allow you to leave here and not to point out some of those errors to us.
Okay, I mean the main one is the one that Mary Lefkowitz leaps upon, which is how could Aristotle have stolen wisdom from the Egyptian library of Alexandria when Alexandria was founded by Aristotle's pupil, Alexander the Great, and the library was founded for another generation. So that if he had talked about the possibility of Aristotle learning the principle of keeping libraries, which I think existed in Memphis, but to use Alexandria as the example is peculiarly unfortunate. Also, I think the case for Egyptian direct influence on Greek philosophy is far stronger when one looks at the pre-Socratics and one looks at Plato and the Neoplatonists than when one looks at Aristotle. So I think that that is a mistake. I also think that the details that he goes into about the ranks of priests and the ranks of initiations do come from these, the novels, Setos and the 18th century novels. Not only Setos, there's also Fénelon's Télémaque. So that there are details which I think are wrong. On the other hand, the basic principle he's laying out, that Greek culture relied very, very heavily indeed on Egyptian culture, and Egyptian culture continued to have a major impact on Greek science in Egypt beyond, after Alexander's conquest, I think is absolutely true and absolutely essential. So I think it is a question of details, but I don't think one can neglect that or omit it.
Professor Bonin, I think we need to ask some questions about Alexander Library itself, it might be a myth. The library itself might be a myth. But no one's ever found the foundation. If they burn the building, you can't burn the foundation because the foundation is underground. So the concept of an Alexandrian library need to be brought into question as to whether it existed at all.
Well, I think here is an example where one looks at competitive plausibility rather than at certainty. Because there are a large number of reports coming from different areas of people employed at the library, people writing on sources drawn from the library, so that there is a circumstantial evidence of the library. There are also stories of destructions of the library by a Christian mob at a certain stage, another branch library. They destroyed a branch library, another one burnt by the Muslims when they came in. So there were lots of books and buildings to be destroyed at a certain point. So I think the chances are there was a library, but I think there were libraries before in Egypt. I don't think one need deny the Egyptian heritage to deny the existence of the Greek one, or the Egypto-Greek one, whatever you should call it.
Yeah, Dr. Burnett, could you explain a little more what you mean that so many ideas contained in the Nag Hammadi prior to Plato, and also was Diodorus classical or Hellenistic? And if he was Hellenistic, could you talk about the reliability of his account?
Well, the first point is, I'm sorry if I misled people, I never said that it was Nag Hammadi had pre-Platonic influences. What I said was the Hermetic texts, which resembled Nag Hammadi texts, may have pre-Platonic. There are references which would fit the period of Persian occupation far better than later periods. And if one gets into the 6th century, and particularly Cambyses' persecution of Egyptian religion, which some of the texts seem to refer to, that these may be pre-Platonic, but not the Nag Hammadi texts themselves, which are presumably around the time of the library itself, so they'd be in the first few centuries of this era. The second question, what was the second question?
Diodorus, was he during the classical or Hellenistic period?
He was during the Hellenistic period, but I don't think one should fall into the classicist game of saying anything that's Hellenistic is valueless. They were far closer to the ancient cultures than we are. And there's not only a very long time period, but also critical breaks with the introduction of Christianity and Islam in the cultural transmission. So that I think one should not dismiss, one shouldn't accept these people uncritically, but one should look and see whether they're circumstantially right, but they often lead, to my mind, in useful directions.
I think for any kind of a study to benefit us, we must show how it relates to us. And as I was listening and as I've been studying ever since I was 10 years of age by just observing what goes on around me. And I think that we must be very careful of white liberalism and many black intellectuals. For example, Clinton, now he was regarded as a so-called intellect. Now this man, when he was questioned about whether or not he smoked marijuana, his answer was, I smoked but I didn't inhale. And we have black people who are supposed to be intellectuals, who have PhDs and all kinds of stuff. They still sit around and debate Clinton as if he's so intellectual, but obviously he's either an idiot or something. And then, in reference to you, Mr. Burnell, you were saying that James, when you were speaking about James and a couple of the other people, you were saying that the black historians were poor. They were not as well economically funded, so that left means for error. I think it's a very deceptive way of almost making yourself seem as a superior researcher. And I believe, like, we just like, even, and I love WBAI, but I think that we must be very careful of some of these liberal people who would like to, and not make black people's struggle be synonymous to, like, homosexuality homosexual struggle. It is not. And we got to get all these things straight. And there's a whole lot more I'd like to say, but I don't have enough time.
Sure. Defend yourself.
I don't think Clinton is a great intellectual, although I had difficulty inhaling myself, so this is very personal. But on the other issue of whether I feel superior, I don't feel superior. I feel in awe of the black scholars. Some of them were privileged, like W.E.B. Du Bois, who had all the things, and there are some, like Sinclair Drake, who also had the advantages of academic things. But I know the privileges that have been heaped upon me. And it's not that I am better, it's just I've been incredibly privileged and lucky, and that has given me time, given me resources, given me all the things that has made it infinitely easier for me to do things. And then, to my surprise, that I often find I've reinvented the wheel. That African American or African scholars have been there before me and seen these things. But I don't think I should pretend that it's been a level playing ground. It hasn't. It's been tipped in my favor very, very markedly.
Okay. Yes, sir.
The distinguished Professor Clarke, in your closing statement, you referred to the situation that, the job situation, so forth, that we have to try and get together on that if we want the economic condition to break within our ranks. And you were so right. But what really triggered my mind is Rosa Parks, this philosophy, this psychology. If we could adopt that and get that out in the mass media, I think this would be a tremendous change in the masses of the blacks. Not only here in New York, but throughout the 48 or 50 states. I just wanted to say that. Rosa Parks, she made a difference.
I have no argument with that, but I think too many of us are trained to hold jobs and not create jobs. And we can create jobs by doing for ourselves what other people are doing for us and making profit from them. If you open a store in Chinatown, you wouldn't get one customer. Why they're so easy to get customers in our neighborhood, we're not racist for thinking this way.
Yeah.
Everybody takes care of his kith and kin in its own respective neighborhood. It's a colonized neighborhood. We can't decolonize Africa until we at least decolonize Harlem.
Okay, thank you very much for that question.
Thank you.
Okay.
First of all, Dr. Clarke and Dr. Burnell, I am honored to be your president at this moment. I would like, for years I've been contemplating on terms like the boss man, an eagle flies on Friday, the white man, and what I would like to, or the man, what I would like to know is, in what time in history did this nomenclature come about? And what I would like to know, was it people of African ancestry who originated that type of nomenclature, or was it the European himself calling himself white in order to perpetuate white supremacy or white nationalism?
No, it's part of European creation and part of the black response to European power and flattery. And another thing which we don't talk about and should understand is there are two levels of Uncle Tomism. There's survival Uncle Tomism, and there's just plain Uncle Tomism. There are blacks who are flatter whites and brush them down and under the breath call them son of bitches. And as the Uncle Tom, strategically Tom, and this is why we misunderstood Booker T. Washington. Laughed when nothing was funny, scratched his head when nothing itched. His strategic Tom brought a school into being, and he said yes when he did not mean yes, so that another generation can say hell no.
Professor Burnell, would you like to comment?
Well, I think after that it's very hard. That's such a perfect answer. But I think the modern relations started with race-based slavery in the 15th century. And so it's relatively recent. That's not to say there wasn't prejudice between peoples of different physical appearance before then, but the absolute horror of racial prejudice, which meant the caste racism, which meant that the best black was worse than the worst white, which was the way in which it was portrayed with slavery, and as a result, and a need to justify slavery, is something that's only been around for 450 years.
Thank you very much.
Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you for coming and being so generous. I have one question for Dr. Burnell, and that is, since we have put great emphasis on contribution, I would like to ask Dr. Burnell, what contrast the contributions during the time when focusing on the time of the Ptolemies when they had occupied Egypt. What contributions pertain to the Macedonians as opposed to the Egyptians? Because there might be some confusion as to who to attribute what to. And the other question I have for Dr. Clarke. I'm not clear as to your position in terms of religion and how much it should occupy our consciousness. So, my question is, do you feel that religion should be totally reevaluated, especially just the notion of God itself, because what we have today tends to be a bit overly corrupted, and it tends to have such a negative impact in our lives. I just have, that's my personal observation. Do you agree? And if not, what is your observation?
I don't believe in religions as such. I think all the major Western religions are male chauvinist murder cults. I am a deeply spiritual human being. I think so much of life I wouldn't step on a cockroach. But because most religions were imposed on people by conquerors, and the conqueror used the religion to control the mind of people and to make them submissive.
Thank you.
In ancient languages, I find no word called religion, and yet I see a demonstration of spirituality.
That's right.
Because Africans tried to bring man in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
Western man tries to defy nature to prove he is a fool. He can't make a hurricane and he can't stop one. He couldn't even stop the recent snow, and he couldn't even clean it up. Man in the face of nature is a very puny thing.
Right.
I remember a poem I wrote in my early 20s. I'll tell you what nature says as she whispers in my ear each day. It's woven into each song she sings. Man compared with me is an insignificant thing.
Sorry to come down to earth after that. But on the Ptolemaic situation, the analogy I would draw, and may not help people, is the Japanese occupation of China in the 1930s and 40s. That is, they believed that everything Japanese was best and tried to impose Japanese models, but a tremendous amount of Japanese culture had itself come from China. Another analogy is a situation after the Islamic Arab conquest, when the culture of Greek-speaking Egypt, or the upper classes who were Greek-speaking in Egypt, was translated into Arabic, or bits were, and carried on. The science and the philosophy developed under early Islam, but yet they drew massively, and no European scholar would deny it, on Aristotle and various other Greek philosophers. And I think that what happened in Ptolemaic times was the Hellenization of Egypt, which meant people writing in Greek. Some of them were Greek, more Egyptians now writing in Greek. And it was a very eclectic civilization. But some of the key figures, like the astronomer Ptolemy or Hieron the inventor, were clearly Egyptians, there's no doubt about it. And one can see in Hellenistic mathematics all sorts of Egyptian influences. So it was, but yet there were Greek things coming in, and they were taking the Greek forms of earlier Egyptian culture in, and that's why I like the Japanese analogy. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, our last question.
Good evening. I'd like to just state that I think the word racism has been totally reduced to shadism. And I think that Mary Lefkowitz, can one extrapolate from her words then that Egypt was black in origin, and many, because at one time there was no conflict with Greek and Egyptian inter-historical unity, because the Egyptians were thought to be not of black origin. So can we extrapolate that now people are assuming, or that she is now assuming, that it is the truth that the Egyptians were not merely a colored variation of something else, but were ethnically black as in shade?
I think it's wrong to use the word black at this juncture in history. We're talking about people of African culture and not of European culture. No one would leave Europe and build an enduring civilization away from home, who they built it at home. When we talk about civilizations, we have to find the rehearsal stage of civilization, because the civilization, like Broadway shows, have to rehearse out of town, and if the rehearsal is not satisfactory, they don't bring the show to town. Now, if you look at the Sudan, there are 42 experimental pyramids. So it's clear that the rehearsal for what became Egyptian civilization started in the south. And if you read chapter 2 in Chancellor Williams' book, Construction of Black Civilization, called Egypt, Ethiopia's Oldest Daughter, and read a similar treatment by John Jackson, an introduction to African civilization, called Egypt, means Ethiopia, the evolution of civilization. Another word, Ethiopian, the origin of civilization. It is unfortunate that we haven't paid proper attention to black scholars like John Jackson, whose one of his last books, Christianity Before Christ, and who calls attention to the fact that St. Augustine said of the conference at Nicaea, these people are giving us a religion we had 3,000 years ago, which we indeed did. Now, the personification of that and the documentation of that religion around a figure called Jesus Christ is still not too well explained, because nothing of consequence was written about him until he was dead 80 years.
I think you misunderstand.
No, tell me what I misunderstood, because first place, I'm at war against color designations, but color designations were not relevant. And they're being used to project Europe into a period and a time where Europe had not even projected itself too well within the body of Europe.
Exactly.
And I'm saying that the woman catechist, Hypatia, who was the daughter of a mathematician, lived in Africa, dwelled in Africa, taught in Africa, created an academy that was the forerunner of the Sunday school. And when I speak of great women in Africa, I include Hypatia, even if she did have some Greek blood, and I can't even prove that. I also include Cleopatra, not because of her color. It is clear that her mother could have been Persian, and her father was obviously Greek. Then why do I include her? Because she had African loyalty. And she was a forerunner of an African nationalist. Now she manipulated Caesar and Mark Antony, and because of this manipulation, she kept the worst aspect of Roman rule off of the back of African people. And in her last words, she said, "I will now join my father, the sun." This proves positively she couldn't have been a Greek woman, because the Greek woman did not worship that particular religion. Now, Dr. Ben and I have friendly arguments over Cleopatra. Dr. Ben said we can let her go and our history will not be damaged in the slightest, because she was a high yellow slut sleeping around with Romans. But I mean, even if this is true, she also has some profound and effective African loyalty that saved Africa during her lifetime from the worst aspects of Roman rule until Octavius, who later became Augusta, who was the brother-in-law of Antony, took exception to Antony's relationship to Cleopatra and Antony's leadership of an Egyptian army, met him in battle and destroyed him. Then he took away Cleopatra's prerogatives. And at this time, she decided that her life was at an end, because she had lost the one thing that meant the most to her, and that is the survival of Egypt itself. She did not die over a man, as Hollywood seemed to indicate, because she could order a man like you order a sandwich and send me another one. But because Hollywood wanted to romanticize the thing, they have her dying over Mark Antony's, death, and when she had advised him not to take on that Roman army because that Egyptian army that day wasn't equal to it.
Yes, I guess what I was talking about was prior to Cleopatra's days, back to the days where the classical Greeks speak of Andromeda and Cassiopeia and the Ethiopian, and Perseus being their liberator, back to the Ethiopians, back pre-Egyptians to the Sudanese people. What I'm claiming is that the origins, the original root of these people as being of black African.
I wish we would just don't be possessed with the word black. Be possessed with the word African culture, not European culture.
Okay, I want to thank you for that.